What's up? What's up? It's the Bankroll Challenge Friday live build. I flew solo last week, and that proved to be a disaster for me. Somehow I played Josh Jacobs and still didn't make money, so I had to bring in a ringer. It is, of course, Drew Dinkmeyer from ETR. Drew, thank you for hopping on with me this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I get so pumped up with the RG intro music. I feel like it's like the perfect intro music for like some like SWAT or cop drama that they like from the 80s, that they like do those openers where like the person looks like they're like doing something interesting and then they flash a look to the camera. Like I feel like there should be just a whole thing built around it.
That's right. We this is the ultimate buddy cop, and Dink and I have to solve the biggest case of all, the week 2 slate. And that's what we are going to do today. I know you were just mentioning you have your weekly tournament leverage column that hasn't gone up yet, but now that you've kind of started to familiarize yourself with the slate, what are your kind of first take feelings?
Yeah, I think my first take feelings on the slate are that this is one that normally it stands out, with the Atlanta-Dallas game having a total that's 4 points higher than everybody else on the slate, that your first inclination would be like, oh, this is just going to be massive chalk and it's going to be hard to avoid. And what do you do in tournaments? And then looking at some of the ownership projections so far, it doesn't look quite as bad as I assumed. So it looks like there's actually still some opportunity there. It does look like a slate that's a little bit binary in terms of the games that you want to attack. There's a few games that you just kind of are ready to throw aside from the start. And so those are interesting ones because, in really, really large field GPP, sometimes those games that get thrown aside can be useful. But in general, my first inclination, honestly, was, that I'm going to be building a lot of Atlanta-Dallas game stacks and kind of, figuring out leverage pieces around them. And then there's a few other games that I'm interested in that I'll mix in as well. But I feel like a lot of those guys should be in the mid-20s, and they're projecting kind of closer to the teens. We'll see. You had mentioned right before the show that there was some news on Amari Cooper that could change things. But that game looks really enticing to me.
Yeah, I did just pull up this one. There was stuff that maybe Amari Cooper would be a game time decision. Then we have Jen Slater here saying that the people she reached out to said there isn't actually concern about them not being available. So we'll have to keep tabs on that. I did want to ask you, like, how does your brain gravitate in general to the idea of like, okay, there's going to be the chalky Atlanta Dallas game. Do I want to get contrarian within that game and still attack that total? Or does your mind gravitate to like, I want to find this week's Minnesota and Green Bay where people aren't on it?
Yeah, so my mind naturally, like, it's interesting because my mind is like a mind meld over the years of being a cash game player and like a one lineup player for so many years that initially my first reaction on slate is always to just try to identify like who the best plays are and figure out from there. And then as I've kind of transformed into this tournament player over the last few years, I've recognized that, okay, once I find the best plays and identify, now I need to figure out how owned they're going to be and whether they're still the best plays or if there's other opportunities. And so right now, to me, this Atlanta-Dallas game, I'll be taking shots both ways. I do think there's one player in particular that looks like he's lagging in ownership considerably in the Atlanta-Dallas game. It's really intriguing to me for GPPs that you can play within that game or even separate from that game. And then there's still not enough ownership for it for me to kind of get away from it entirely. So I will probably honestly be attacking it from both angles. I play a lot of different lineups, so it's kind of the way that I go about things. But if I was to play, just one lineup this week, I would probably be trying to get a little bit contrarian within that game and still looking to that game.
Well, you say you play multiple lineups. Are you tossing lineups into these single entry contests still? Yeah.
Yeah, I do. But I don't use like one lineup for all single entry contests or anything like that. I will use different lineups across the single entry and the 3max. And to me, it's kind of like I generate a bunch of lineups and then I randomize which ones go where. Sometimes if I play like one contest that is wildly different in terms of the price tag, like if I play like the Thunderdome one week, that will be like hand built and specifically entered for that. But if I'm playing like the $75 3max or the Spy or all these different entries, like to me, it's all somewhat similar, and I'm better at creating GPP lineups as a whole than I am identifying the specific one that's going to be the one to place in the specific tournament.
Yeah, I know my buddy Brick75, he does the same thing with his single entry lineups where he's just randomizing his set and it doesn't matter if your lineup's positive EV, you put it in the contest. I do think it can get a little bit different depending on the contest size. One of my gripes with DraftKings is I want when you export the CSV, I want one of the columns to be the contest size. Because then often, like say if I'm exporting a set of lineups by points projected or ownership, like I want to, okay, I can put this higher owned lineup in the smaller contest size as opposed to going back and forth from the screen. But it sounds like you have more of a Zen approach to it where you're just going to put those lineups in wherever.
My thought process on it with NFL is honestly like, no matter how big the contests are in NFL, they're all big. And the prize pools are usually a little bit more weighted towards the top. I'm trying to find better tournaments. And actually, DraftKings, I thought, did a really good job week one. There were a lot more tournaments that were single entry 3 max, where it was like 10% of the prize pool to first, 1% of the prize pool to 10th, which I think is a great payout structure. But in general, if you get something that funnels up to the top of any of the GPPs during the course of an NFL week, I'm going to have a winning week. Whether it's like my best lineup is in like the $3.20 max or whatever, like the prize pools are just so big that I'm not as concerned about trying to necessarily like maximize the right lineup in the right contest. It's easier for me to just kind of make sure I'm creating the right types of lineups.
That makes sense. We have over in the chat, Bugs McRoon says Drew Dinkmeyer in the Wellie Maker 4.0. Let's also talk about that real quick here. You got that campaign launched again. What is our current update on that?
Yeah, so Wellie Maker 4.0 is going strong. We're doing something a little bit different this year. In the past, the Wellie Maker has kind of been a standalone campaign, but this year Charity Water is actually running a campaign during the month of September where they're looking to raise enough money to give 20,000 people in Mali clean, sustainable drinking water solutions for the rest of their life. It's a particularly important time to do this with coronavirus spreading in these countries that just don't have the healthcare systems to be able to handle it. Getting them access to clean water, to wash their hands, to drink and whatnot helps prevent the spread of disease as well. And so this year we're doing it for just September. We've raised so far over $30,000. We've hit our first $10,000 match situation. We will match the next $10,000 when we hit $40,000 in total. You can go to my Twitter at Drew Dinkmeyer and you can see my pinned tweet that has a video with more details behind the mission and the cause. But the idea behind the Wellie Maker was basically, for me, I throw so many entries during the course of an NFL season into these tournaments where I'm hoping to change the course of my life forever by, banking one of these big JPPs. And why not take a few of those entries and instead of hoping to change my life, guarantee changing someone else's life by donating to this cause. So I've been doing it for 4 years now. The community's been incredibly supportive. It's been awesome. If we get to 70,000 this year in total donations, we'll have raised over $300,000 in the first 4 years, which is just mind blowing and delivering, life-changing access to clean water for people for the rest of their lives.
That's great. Yeah. And I'm planning to donate this year, but I was also trying to think of a little head-to-head Wellie Maker GPP action before. You said you're going to be in the SPY. I'll obviously be in the SPY this week. You want to do a little side bet. Whoever finishes higher, the loser has to put in another couple $100 to the Wellie.
Yeah, let's do it. Name your price and I'm game.
All right, let's do $200 is the bounty. Whoever finishes worst between the two of us has to put an extra 200 in there.
Perfect. Love it.
All right. The stakes are established. Now I'm going to pump you for all your information and leverage that against you in the contest. One other thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately as it pertains to, single entry and 3 max is this idea of the game stacking. I've been talking with Leone about it. We've been doing the $1,500 single entry on our line movement show. And it made intuitive sense what Mike had said of this concept of it makes more sense to game stack in these smaller fields because you're just having to get less things right as opposed to the Millie Maker, where if you have Calvin Ridley and Julio Jones, it's like, well, every time one of them scores, the other isn't scoring, where you want to hit all those one-off pieces. Do you approach the single entries or all of your lineups differently depending on how big the contest is as far as those stacking rules?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting conversation because I think this is one of the things where we're getting like levels on levels on levels of DFS game theory over the years, because I think, the last few years it was kind of clearly established that the field just wasn't stacking enough, whether it was single stacks or double stacks with a bring back. It just wasn't happening frequently enough in GPPs. And so there's an edge to be had in those. And now the pendulum is starting to swing in the direction of these super large field contests where perfection is close to what's required, that you might have to start scaling back some of the stacking to try to get more of the perfection. I personally am still aiming for more and more of the game stacking, even in the super large field contests, simply because I want to be able to try to advance with getting fewer things right. I do think in the context of really chalky games, you need to be a little bit more careful on that. So in the case of like Dallas, Atlanta this week with Ridley and Julio Jones and heavier price tag players at chalky ownership in super large field contests, I think you do need to be a little bit more careful because they start to eat into the ceiling, as you noted, together. And that might be harder when like a Wellie Maker, where so much of the prize pool is to the one spot. So I still think in lower owned game stacks, it makes sense to double stack. It makes sense to bring back. In higher owned ones, though, I think you need to be more thoughtful, which might mean just honestly in general, in some of the higher owned game stacks in Wellie Maker type contests where the payout structure is so wildly tilted to first place, you might just want to avoid the high owned game stacks in general, even if you think they're not as owned as they should be, just so you can make sure that you get contrarian. Because ultimately you can, as like we've learned many years ago from a lot of Jonathan Bale's writing in the industry, you can win these GPPs by being kind of anti-fragile and hoping that things kind of work against the field. So I think it depends a little bit on the type of stack that you're trying to build and the ownership and the price tags associated with it. But I do agree with the concept in general that smaller fields are more conducive to full game stacks because it's one less decision point that you need to get right.
Yep. JK in KC, we actually touched on this at the beginning. I've been playing one lineup in the single entries. Drew is playing just from his larger lineup set, so he'll vary it up. Let's talk about some of the other games that are interesting. Obviously, Atlanta Dallas is going to be catching a lot of ownership. One other interesting game to me, based on the prices, Pat Thorman identified it as a pace up spot, is this Arizona Washington game. On the other side, Brandon Thorne also identifies this as a bad offensive line, defensive line matchup for Washington. How do you factor in kind of those decision points? We saw last week with the Eagles, that offensive line play ended up being a huge factor. Are you starting to weight this line play in your decisions?
Absolutely. So I definitely weighted the line play in my decisions last week. I know Adam Levitan was really, really hard on touting the Washington defense last week. And I think my play, going back to like years past, if I hadn't have taken that into consideration, I probably would have played a lot more Philadelphia Washington stacks because I saw the opportunity for condensed offensive volume with Philadelphia without Alshon Jeffrey, with Jalen Reagor somewhat limited, with Washington having a poorer secondary and kind of struggling in years past. And then Washington's side looks for really condensed offense with, Haskins and McLaurin. And we didn't know Logan Thomas or Antonio Gibson as cheap options as well, but there were good price tags all over that game. And I was much lighter that game than I would have been in years past because of the line play. Now, the matchup with Arizona, I think, is a little bit different because of the mobility of Kyler Murray compared to the mobility of Carson Wentz. Carson Wentz, his mobility is great within the pocket, and he's able to usually give himself a little bit more time. I also think the Eagles' line play last week was one of the weaker situations we'll see all year with the number of injuries that they dealt with. So I'm a little bit more likely to play this week the Arizona-Washington side, even though I do have some concerns about the offensive line for Arizona holding up against that Washington pass rush because of Kyler's, if we're unlocking Kyler's upside, it's through his legs. And we kind of saw that last week against San Francisco, right? That's one of the best defensive lines in all of football. And we got, 91 rushing yards or whatever it was from Kyler and a touchdown. And so I'm in on that game. That's my second favorite game after Atlanta Dallas this week when you factor in concentrated offenses, price tags, and ownership. It doesn't look like there's going to be a ton of ownership on these guys outside of Christian Kirk, which is just it just goes to show where DFS is these days, right? The guy who's like the utter disappointment, the airball of week one. is high owned in week 2, and the guy who went for 14, 151 and 0 is not projecting for is projecting for like the same ownership. It's not much different.
Yeah, I think the how you handle this Arizona offense is very interesting, because you mentioned all of the rushing upside. We know that with these rushing quarterbacks, obviously Lamar, Josh Allen, Cam Newton now, that you don't even necessarily have to stack them, or you can get away with the single stack. So then what happens here when you just said this is a very obvious rushing spot for Kyler? He has his wide receiver one in DeAndre Hopkins, and yet Christian Kirk is the volume play, or the punt play. So can you double stack Kyler with Hopkins and Kirk, or is one of them going to lose it because he's going to be rushing so much?
So I think you can still double stack. Here's how I would look at it. If you're going to play Christian Kirk, I kind of think you should double stack. It's weird to say that, but because he's going to carry enough ownership on his own, that you want kind of the correlation from, if you're going to play Christian Kirk and Kyler Murray. If you're going to play Kirk on the other side of this with like Haskins and McLaurin and Thomas, like that's fine. But if you're going to play Kirk with Murray, I kind of think you want the overall game environment and the lower owned combination of Kyler, Hopkins, Kirk to lower the individual ownership impact of Kirk, who I think might come. It wouldn't surprise me if he comes in greater than 15%. And Hopkins, it wouldn't surprise me if he's closer to 10 or 9 or 8, something like that, just because of the pricing on this slate. So I think when I was thinking through game stacks on this situation, I was kind of thinking you can mega game stack it with Murray, Kirk, Hopkins, Thomas, McLaurin, and all the price tags like make it work, and it's not too much of an impediment to still build out a lineup that you like with running backs. Or you could take it like Kyler, Hopkins, McLaurin, and get away from the cheaper chalk of Thomas and Kirk and create some leverage on those pieces.
Yeah, it's funny you say that too, because I was looking at Cardi's stuff on the Blitz. He has the stack projections, and I'll head over here to the double stack with the bring back. It's all from that game.
Yeah.
As far as like the Dallas Atlanta as well, but then it's all Kyler and I wanted to search by points per dollar for the value. It's all Haskins, McLaurin. So that one is interesting as well. And I do agree with you too about the double stacking. It also feels kind of similar to like last year when if I would do one of those gross Panthers Kyle Allen stacks, it's like I have to have Christian McCaffrey in here with it. So I'm leaning that way, where I don't think I'm going to play Kirk as a one-off, not to mention like what would be more tilting than watching DeAndre Hopkins get 15 yards without Kirk.
As somebody who's really heavy on Christian Kirk in best ball leagues and seasonal leagues and light on DeAndre Hopkins, it was tilting enough for week 1. So I'm going to make sure that I have some Hopkins Kyler stacks in week 2.
And how are you thinking about Kenyon Drake? And I think this is kind of an interesting thing. So we do like these games. How do you think about the running backs within those games, either as offering leverage or as part of being part of a game stack? Do you consider like a QB running back, say Dak, Gallup, Zeke as a viable double stack, or even Kyler, Kenyon Drake, Kirk? Are those double stacks you're interested in, or is that kind of skirting what you'd like to do?
So this is more for me where you get into the small field versus really large field conversation. In the smaller field on tournaments, I think stacking an offense entirely is totally fine, especially when it comes with a running back that has a more elevated price tag like a Zeke or even Kenyon Drake. He's not like super cheap. But in like Millie makers and whatnot, it starts to put a lot of pressure on the lineup to get like kind of the ceiling game from a higher priced running back, the ceiling game from a mid or elevated price quarterback, and the ceiling game from a receiver as well. So in kind of the really large field tournaments, this is where I think you need to be a little bit more cognizant of making sure that your double stacks are a little bit more specifically wide receiver, tight end oriented than running back, even if the running back catches some passes, just because it's so unlikely that the bulk of their upside is going to come entirely through the passing game.
I hate to distract us on this very good conversation, but David Kitchen in the chat wants to know where your next support is.
It's right behind me.
Oh, there we go. Now we're on it.
Yeah. So Kitchen always likes my my Star Trek space Space Cadet setup here. He likes to comment on it quite a bit.
I just like to imagine it's now with coronavirus, you're having like your dentist come over to your house and you can just pull that right up and you're just right there.
Back like this. Yeah. Get the old house call. Exactly.
So one thing that I've been, on the Swolecast, we blew Davis's mind by talking about this concept of people hand building versus using optimizers. It's funny because I'm a mix of both. And what I wanted to do here right now is just run kind of 100 lineups with the optimal just to kind of give us a baseline of where to work with. Is that a similar process of how you start out, or let's say you were exclusively going to make single entry and 3 max? Would an optimizer be in your process?
So I think it would be in my process to get a feel for what looks like optimal projected lineups and then see if they're correlating really strongly with ownership. If they are correlating really strongly with ownership, then it doesn't really help me a ton because I need to kind of figure out a way to still get around. So you can put in like ownership constraints and different things to start seeing what types of lineups you get. And I think that's useful information. It doesn't mean you have to pull those lineups and absolutely play those lineups, but I think it starts to give you the framework of like, okay, this stack looks like, it's going to be relatively under-owned. And this is a potential option. So I think optimizers have a place, whether you're a hand builder or not, in creating lineups. For me, generally, I create almost all my lineups through an optimizer unless I am playing a really high stakes single entry contest that is like outside of my normal bankroll issues. If I'm like burning, crowns or whatever I'm doing for a little gamble. Then I'll hand build. But in general, for me, like I set all my rules and I set all my like parameters for the optimizer and what I'm trying to accomplish. And then I start running and I start looking at how the teams look and I kind of look through all the teams and then I tighten or loosen parameters and I keep doing that until I get a set that I'm comfortable with.
Okay. Yeah, that makes complete sense. And what you said about if you were playing single entries that were outside of your bankroll, that really resonated with me.
Yeah. If you're just here for the gamble and then you want to feel like you have like, authoritarian control over your lineup. You don't want to throw it in the hands of the optimizer that's just randomly throwing lineups around. You want to feel totally responsible because at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you have the plays that you want in your lineup, but you also have many, many different outs that you can blame when things go wrong. Like you don't need just the optimizer that can blame. You can blame us on this show. You can blame your favorite tout. You can blame your favorite projection system. So if things go wrong, even if you've hand built the lineup yourself, you still don't have to accept any responsibility for it whatsoever. You don't need the optimizer to defer that responsibility to.
Yeah, no, and I'm with you. I like using it as a starting point. I did want to ask you here before I run a few of these. I'm just setting up one primary stack here. So for the single entry thing, right now I have a quarterback to 2 pass catchers, and then with a bring back of anybody on the other team. You were mentioning in the smaller field, so like this DraftKings SPY this week is 1,100. Would you consider or recommend I change to 1 wide receiver tight end and then 1 running back wide receiver?
That would be my approach. Yeah. Okay.
And my mouse is tweaking. I don't want 4. I got this new mouse with like this scroll thing, and it's just like killing me with my. This is why you got to be on team hand build. The optimizer is out of control. This isn't RotoGrinders' fault. This is my mouse's fault. Okay, and then I was actually talking with Brick about this the other day, and he wasn't sure that there was a huge correlation with the running back bring back relative to the wide receiver tight end. Are you still good including any position on the other team, or do you skew towards wide receiver tight end?
I skew towards wide receiver tight end, but I am good with bringing back any position on that team. And by the way, what a great name for a GPP player, a username than Brick. I think it should be Brick 150 instead of Brick 75, but I mean, couldn't be a better GPP player's name.
That's right. Yep. And then, if you have a significant other you could play with, it could be Brick 300.
Brick 300.
Brick 300 sounds like a new product.
Yeah.
Get the new Brick 300. Okay, let's see here why these are running. Here's a question. If you were running a 20 max in an optimizer, how many unique QBs would you typically use? Does anything jump out for you there?
So I'll use this as an opportunity to talk generally about optimizers. I get a lot of questions around using optimizers or player pools or different things like that. That people view it almost as like it's a slot machine that you have to decode, and if you put in just the right buttons, you pull the slot and you get all the winners. And that's not necessarily how it works. So in general, like my player pool at each position will differ based on the week, and not necessarily like the same for each and every week. So last week in a 20 max, I probably had like 7 or 8 different quarterbacks because I was kind of taking an approach where I really feel like I didn't know where the concentrated volume was going to come from, and I was kind of spreading my exposure at the quarterback position. This week, I would probably be closer to like 4 or 5. So it just depends on the week and your level of confidence and kind of the quarterbacks that you're looking to run out there and the stacks that you're running out there and how concentrated the set is overall. I don't think every week requires the same exact approach. And that's where I know a lot of people want guidelines for things to use for optimizers and different things that they do. But I really think each slate you need to kind of come at it with a fresh perspective and think through how you want to attack it and what your goal is with the optimizer.
Yeah. Yep. Let's hop over here, see what it spit out. Interesting here, I guess not surprising that we're getting a lot of Cowboys here. Jonathan Taylor is going to be the mega chalk. We are getting Kyler to DeAndre fitting in here. So when you scan, say, at this top optimal using our constraints, although did this take? I don't think it took, did it?
I don't think so. I also probably would not have 3 players from one team with them unstacked. I think that's probably not an optimal route to go.
I don't think our build rule stuck.
I think you forgot to add the 1 wide receiver tight end.
Oh, that's what happened.
Yeah.
See, this was my mouse was tweaking.
Yeah.
All right, let's try this again. What about total players in a player pool, not position specific?
So similar answer. I never think about how many total players I have in a player pool. Like it's not even something that I look at the end of the week to see how many did I have, how many didn't I have. It's not a decision point for me at all. It comes down to essentially like when I scan all my individual exposures at the end of looking at a set, are there players that I look at and I'm like, there's no way this guy has the upside to get into a winning GPP lineup. And then I start Xing those players out. And then eventually I just run. I mean, I probably run 10 to 20 different sets during the course of the week, like narrowing and kind of like tweaking things. And then once I get a set that I feel like comfortable with the way lineup 150 looks compared to lineup 1, and the individual exposures don't have any players that I think like, those guys can't possibly win me a GPP, then I'm good to go. And whatever the total number of players left is, it is what it is. I never even look at it.
And this is actually kind of the crux of the whole hand build versus using the optimizer, because with the optimizer, what Drew's describing is he's letting the math dictate his exposures. Whereas I think sometimes when we go to build our hand build lineups, we're like, well, I know I want to have Christian Kirk there.
Yeah.
So like all of a sudden in your 3 max set, you just set yourself at 66%, Kirk, because you're deciding those exposures manually. So I think that's something to pay attention to. All right, I got my settings working. So this looks better and kind of illustrates what we were talking about earlier with this Kyler, Kenyon Drake, Hopkins. I mean, this to me, minus kind of the uncertainty around Amari, does look like an optimal type lineup. So what does your first glance think of how you would start working off of this, even after we said that we do like the Arizona game?
So very first thing that I'd look at is projected ownership, and RotoGrinders has that feature right there for you to look at, 118% projected ownership. I think Adam Levitan and Mike Leone's DK Wellie Maker analysis article said that basically the field was higher than, I think it was like 125, and the Wellie Maker winners or top 10s were generally less than 125. So that would be the first thing, is like looking at that ownership and is it in a threshold that is like reasonable to play in GPPs. And I think anything below like 125 is probably pretty reasonable. So right off the bat, I think we're like okay in terms of how it stacks up. You would also generally want to try to find a player. So like that lineup there, lineup 44, that's at 148.5% ownership. Probably not. I mean, that's probably getting close to a cash game type lineup. Probably not a lineup you want to throw in a GPP. So that would be kind of the first look. And then the second look I'd scan for is, do I have individual pieces on this lineup that are sub 10% and sub 5%, or is my like 125% ownership all from dudes who are going to be like 15% owned? Because all from 15% owned is actually much worse than having a player that's 25% owned and a player that's sub 5% owned. Just because the way the product of ownership works in terms of duplicates and in terms of impact. So I think it's really a spot where you want to be thoughtful on looking at, okay, what pieces now are the ones that I could potentially interchange out to get one of those sub 5% GPP plays in. And obviously, if it's an Atlanta Dallas game stack, it wouldn't be players from that game. If it was an Arizona Washington game stack, it wouldn't be players from that game. So you'd start to look at, like, on that lineup one, okay, who's a viable replacement for maybe like Deontay Johnson, or I mean, he would be the main guy, or maybe Zeke, or maybe Amari. Maybe you don't want Zeke and Amari in the same lineup together. But I do think this like sets a framework of like, okay, I can stack this game and I can get relatively good ownership. I just need to move a few pieces around.
Yeah, and then I like also you can click over to the player exposures tab, see in these 100 lineups all the players that popped up, and you can quickly scan down here and say who's projecting well from a points per dollar that might not be catching a lot of ownership. So to Drew's point, when he's saying, Deontay Johnson here at 15.6%, well, Mike Williams is going to end up being a similar price there at 4.2. Doesn't have project for quite the same volume, but could project for a very similar ceiling. He was in the air yards by low model for what seems like the millionth time. So are those the kind of 1v1 pivots you would be looking at to make it unique?
Exactly. I think that's exactly the approach that you want to take. And then you can also scan down a little bit further and, you see some of the secondary pieces in Dallas, Washington, that are making it in, and they're only making it in largely because they're tied to the game that you're specifically trying to stack, or they're tied to other players that project well. But I think those players can often be the contrarian pieces as well and create leverage within the game on the players who are going to command ownership. So if it's that Dallas-Atlanta game, you're going to get ownership from Julio and Ridley and Amari, assuming he's healthy, and Zeke. And it seems like CeeDee Lamb is going to get ownership this week because it seems like everybody's talking there. But Gallup might not get as much ownership. And so Gallup might be like a natural leverage play off of some of the other chalkier pieces in that game. And so that's another way that I'd look to potentially dampen the ownership of the overall lineup.
What do you think about this Russell Gage ownership at 3%? Obviously, I think that's really nice at his price and ownership. He's coming off of a 12-target game, though. That ownership feels a little low to me.
It does in the context of the box score, because we know that people love to look at box scores. Like, one of the first thing everybody does after they put the guys in the lineup is they like click on the name, and then they go see like the game log, and they're like, okay, I feel good about this guy. But that being said, it's also Russell Gage. And I don't know that 4.8K Russell Gage. I know Evan Silva likes to remind everybody that I won a Wellie Maker with Harry Douglas, which Russell Gage feels very Harry Douglas-esque. But I don't know that 4.8K Russell Gage is going to command much ownership. So I think 3 to 5-6% is probably going to be right.
It also seems like tight end would maybe be a good place to get lower owned this week. The ownership seems relatively spread out and a lot of decent options here. Anything jumping out to you?
Well, the first thing is I think that Chris Herndon ownership is going to skyrocket when everybody gets to updating their projected ownerships. The news that Jamison Crowder is going to miss the game is really going to get screwy with some Jets projections, because you don't like who do you give that volume to? He had 13 targets last week. He had like a 35+% target share. Some of it's going to funnel over to Chris Herndon. I think I saw a note that Adam said he thought Braxton Berrios would probably get the slot opportunities, but I mean, there's just not going to be a target hog there between Perryman and Chris Hogan, who's a known just wind sprinter out there running fly routes left and right. So I think Herndon's going to end up being chalky. I think another way to think about single entry or hand build GPP lineups in general is that everybody wants to play the cheap tight end.
Yeah.
So you get these weeks And tight end is such a fragile position in general, and the floor is really, really low. So you get some of these weeks where you'll get like a cheap, chalky tight end that's projecting for like 25% ownership. I don't know if it'll be Herndon this week, but my guess is by the end of, by Sunday morning, when is Jamina still doing the ownership projections for RG?
I believe so, yeah.
I believe when he gets to it, my guess is that number goes way up. And so that's a spot where I think chalky tight ends are always a spot to diversify off of. I think this week is a little bit harder because like some of the guys you're used to like looking to at tight end for like big upside. Kittle, there's some health concerns around, but Kelsey and Ertz and Andrews are all probably good GPP plays once again, just because people do not like to build through the higher priced tight ends. And if they hit, they can separate so much at that position because chalk fails so frequently at tight end.
Yeah, and I'm kind of the mindset that Mark Andrews is going to just take that leap and have a Kelsey Kittle-like season. Yeah. Obviously, week one validated that, but it still seems like his ownership might lag a little bit behind just because of how people are wanting to build with jamming in all of these running backs. So, yeah, I love going back to Mark Andrews. And that game could pop off at pretty low ownership as well. Let's hop over here to the SPY. Now that we've kind of gotten a lay of the land for what some of these optimals are looking like, Drew and I will build a lineup. As I always caveat, I will not necessarily be playing this lineup in the SPY, but it gives us a good framework for the type of plays we might be looking at. I'll kick things off to you. What is a play you'd like to put in here for us to start?
Well, whenever I'm thinking about hand building a lineup, the first thing that I'm thinking about is like, what's the story, Pete? What's the story we're telling about the lineup?
We crack our knuckles. I just want to make sure our hands are ready for kind of the in the weeds work we're about to do here.
Yeah. So what's the story that we want to tell with this lineup, Pete? I know you're a great storyteller, not as great of a GPP player. We're working on connecting the two together. But what's the story we want to tell with this lineup? What's the game environment that we're trying to target?
I mean, maybe the story is everyone's wrong on this Atlanta-Dallas game, and it's the Washington-Arizona game where all the magic's going to happen.
All right, let's do it. So if we're building a Washington-Arizona stack, I know Dwayne Haskins is cheap, but I want Kyler's upside at 6,100. So let's start with Kyler.
And I agree with you. Like, to your point, if Kyler was priced like, closer to Mahomes or something, and then it makes sense. But at 6,100,
Kyler should be in like that Dak, Josh Allen price range.
Yeah. Okay. So now I could take the easy way out and bring in a Washington bring back and make you decide how we're going to do this. But I think I'm with you. If I have Kyler, I want DeAndre Hopkins coming off of that monster target game. It seems like the combination of floor and ceiling is going to be there. They're at home running a ton of plays. And 7,700 still is a reasonable price tag to me.
Yeah. And I don't think the ownership is going to get out of hand because of that price tag, because everybody's going to want to spend on those running backs this week. So I think it's a really good opportunity for him.
Yep. All right, ball is back in your court.
So I will go back to a week one disappointment for me, but to complete this mini game stack, and then we can decide if we want to kind of really expand the game stack. But Terry McLaurin, there's no reason that anything from week one that happened should discourage you from McLaurin. He played over 90% of snaps. He had a target share north of 20%. He didn't end up converting in a big way, but catching 5 to 7 balls for 61 yards, totally fine. The ownership is going to come way down this week. I think he's going to be like maybe 10% owned, somewhere around there. I think we have him in the 5 to 8% owned range right now. And so I think the price tag is just a little bit annoying with all these 4K wide receivers that people are going to want to play alongside the stud running backs. And so I think right off the bat, we've got two modestly, at worst case scenario, modestly owned pieces from a compelling game environment that we're excited about. And they interact with each other well in terms of the passing side. So I think we're off to a good start here.
Yeah, and I do think normally the field would be ready to go right back to McLaurin in this game environment. But I think what I'm seeing the chatter, in Mike Clay's wide receiver cornerback matchup, writing about the matchup versus Patrick Peterson.
Yeah.
So I think he could go low owned as people want to avoid that situation. Well, here's one. Just is in the smaller field, is the Jonathan Taylor chalk avoidable?
So here's what I'll say. I think if you're avoiding the Jonathan Taylor chalk, you should be playing Naheem Hines.
Okay.
I think it's really hard to avoid both of them with the volume of targets that Phillip Rivers gives running backs. It's hard. You're kind of hoping for basically Indy's offense to just totally fail. And I think Hines is a fine pivot from Taylor, but Taylor, I mean, has just monstrous upside. Like, he could have had a huge game last week, and his opportunities weren't even that great. But he clearly, to me, looked like the more explosive player. I thought Hines looked fine, but Taylor's a tough fade this week. I think if you are fading him, you should be playing Hines.
Yeah, and for people who maybe aren't playing in the dynasty leagues and stuff and know what type of prospect Jonathan Taylor was, I mean, he looked like Ezekiel Elliott as a running back prospect. If this draft was a few years ago, he goes top 10 in the draft like Zeke and Fournette did. So this isn't just some bye week guy filling in here. I mean, this is a really, really good player who is probably mispriced by like $1,500 in this matchup.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead and put him in. I do like that call, though, of having either him or Hines. Okay, who do you like next?
So I think this is a big decision point for us because ultimately right now with this lineup, I think the worst play we could make at tight end is Chris Herndon. Absolute worst play we could make. I think he's going to come with ownership. And if we're going to play that price, we should be playing Logan Thomas.
Yep.
So this is sort of the situation where with this specific lineup, we have to make the decision. Are we going cheap at tight end? Or are we going kind of, upper tier tight end and trying to bring some ceiling there that will put a little bit of salary pressure on the rest of the lineup? My lean is to go full on game stack with this game.
Yeah.
And my lean is to go Logan Thomas.
Okay.
But if I didn't go Logan Thomas here, I would probably go Mark Andrews. Or I would look to that Ertz Goddard kind of tier. They're a little bit Goddard's a little bit priced up, but that's like no man's land for tight end salary. Like people just don't play it. So it would be Thomas or Andrews most likely for me in this spot. But I think this gives you a lot of flexibility to still have money to spend, and you can spend it because the high price players, you can always find high price players that are less chalky than the really chalky high price ones. So you can always control your ownership on the high price guys a little bit more than you can on the low price guys.
So now my heart is racing, being like, okay, we know that we're going to put another Cardinals player in here. And I'm terrified of making the wrong decision between Kirk and Drake. It just feels like one of those situations, whichever one I do, the other one is going to drop off. The Kirk lover in me wants to play Kirk. But I'm also thinking about him being chalky and not as involved. And whereas we kind of know Drake's role, where do you lean?
I would go. This is one where since I'm going the full stack and I've got Kyler, I want the receivers.
That's what I needed to hear.
Yeah, so I would go Kirk. If I was playing Haskins, I'd more consider Drake in this spot.
Yeah.
But for Drake's ceiling to really hit, it's probably coming via rushing touchdowns. And those are impeding the offensive upside of Kyler, to some extent. So I would go Kirk here.
Okay, I'm just going to give us a placeholder. I'm going to put the Colts defense in here, 2,500. We got Jonathan Taylor. So that leaves us 7,100 for running back in flex. There's definitely some running back options here. Just structurally, are you leaning running back or wide receiver in the flex here, do you think?
I don't have a strong opinion on it. I think running back in the flex generally gives you a little bit higher floor, and I think is a fine approach. But I would be totally open. What I would be thinking of doing though is ideally I would be trying to find some correlation. Either right now we have all Washington, Arizona guys, and we have an Indy guy.
Yeah.
I would be trying to find some correlation between these last two pieces. So two skill players in the same game, and that alone is the reason why I would maybe lean a little bit more wide receiver in the flex, because I generally don't often find two running backs from the same game to have the kind of upside that I'm looking for. But I would want a little bit of extra juice correlation in this lineup. And this is where, like last week, I didn't have a ton of Aaron Rodgers or Kirk Cousins, but I had a lot of my Devontae Adams lineups had Adam Thielen. or Dalvin Cook in them. And I think that's ways you can increase your correlation in these lineups and make better GPP lineups as well.
Someone in the chat says Cooper and Julio. We need a running back. Is there a Cooper running back?
We got to play someone who's a running back.
Yeah. And this is also an interesting thing too of, none of our plays, I don't think here are going to be like uber chalk, but a lot of these Washington, Arizona guys are going to come in.
We need somebody that's going to be low. I think we need, our story was to avoid this Dallas Atlanta game, assume that it's going to be over owned. And so I think we need to walk away from that game, as good as it would feel to finish this lineup with like Zeke and Ridley or whatever it is.
Yeah.
You can't do it. You can't do it.
The three names my eyes are gravitating to here are Cook, although that probably doesn't make sense with the Taylor Colts, but it would be Clyde Edwards-Helaire or Aaron Jones would be kind of the ceiling, lower owned running back plays. I think that would make sense here.
Yeah. I'm trying to think through. So Aaron Jones isn't going to have any counterpart, but we would have room to upgrade a defense if we wanted to go with like Marvin Jones. So we could go that route. We could go the Jones duo. If we went Clyde Edwards-Helaire, what's like Keenan Allen's price tag?
Keenan Allen, I think he is. Let's see here, 5,700. So that's a nice price tag.
So that's one we could do where we could upgrade the defense as well. And those are situations where you can get a little bit of unique lineup construction.
You also get a little late swap equity there with Keenan, which would be nice.
Which is always useful. I think that's a pretty interesting combination. I'm trying to look through the running back prices in our values and who else kind of stands out. That's probably the best one. I don't think there's a Rams wide receiver that we could pair with Miles Sanders that would be worthwhile in terms of the pricing. We would get a little stuck. We could do something like that and then upgrade tight end.
Yeah.
That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I don't mind getting out if Logan Thomas is going to be, that gets us up to Higbee with Everett banged up is pretty interesting.
So, but Higbee's interesting. So let's put in Sanders over Edwards-Helaire.
Okay.
And let's see, see what we're left working with here.
That would get us up 200 off of
$200. Okay, so do we have a $5,500 option on the Rams? Do we have one?
On the Rams?
Yeah.
Let's see.
Or on Houston.
Yeah, I mean, Fuller 6,300.
Okay.
Who else?
Woods and Cup are probably above that.
Woods 64, Cup 67.
Okay. And then Higbee is probably
Higbee's 47.
So could do the double tight end, which there's a lot of talk against double tight end. I think double tight end is a bad strategy when you're using cheap tight ends. When you're using tight ends that don't have a legitimate ceiling behind them.
Yeah.
So I think Higbee is viable if we wanted to go that route. Looking at other potential combinations here.
I do kind of like that the Clyde Edwards-Helaire Keenan for that game. And then Higbee there, but you're not getting any correlation.
No, that works.
I think that's a nice lineup.
That works.
It's fair.
I think that works. And what's Higbee's projected ownership for this? I'm guessing it's super low. That would be our sub 5%. Him and Keenan Allen. Yeah, we've got Higbee at like 2 to 4% owned.
Okay. Yeah.
So you've got Keenan and we've got Keenan. I'm guessing probably super low as well.
So even if that game stack ends
up, we've got Keenan at 2 to 4% owned. So even if that game stack is chalky, we've got 2 outs at low ownership on the pass catchers.
Yeah, I like this. This is a nice lineup here. I definitely think I'm gravitating toward a Kyler build here, and I bet mine will end up looking relatively similar to this. We'll see what the Opto bro Drew tosses into the spy, but this was a lot of fun. Thank you for hopping on with me here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Pete. Love all your work.
Thank you. Yes, I've all of my famous GPP work that has yet to yield any fruits to my labor, but one of these days it's happening. And again, guys, check out the Wellie Maker. Drew has it pinned on his Twitter. A really great cause that Drew has done an excellent job kind of bringing to life into the DFS community. So check that out. We will have our stakes. One of us will be ponying up an extra $200. Whoever finishes higher in our head-to-head GPP within the SPY. Check out all of Drew's work on ETR. His tournament leverage column, which should be coming out soon, was one of my favorite reads of last week. So for Drew Dinkmeyer, for RotoGrinders, I'm Peter Overzet, and this week we are going to win the SPY, folks.